Millionaire sees his old ring on a poor girl's finger. Then truth explodes. A billionaire stuck on a lonely country road. A 10-year-old girl in a faded t-shirt and worn sneakers walks by, carrying nothing but a backpack and a quiet kind of confidence. Her hands are covered in grease. Her eyes scan the smoking engine of the sleek red Mustang, as if she were born to understand it. The man, Julian Blackwell, laughs at first, until he sees it. The ring, glinting on her small finger. Emerald green, antique gold, tied down with a piece of string. And just like that, the world he thought he knew begins to crumble. Because that ring was his. Given to a little girl 12 years ago at an orphanage that was mysteriously shut down and wiped from every public record. A girl he'd searched for and never found. A promise he broke. A memory he buried. And now, standing before him in the middle of nowhere, that same ring is staring back at him from the hand of a child who shouldn't exist. What happens next will unravel a secret so deep, it could take down $1 billion empire. And the girl? She's not just a lost child. She's the key to a system built on lies. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where forgotten stories and hidden truths come back to life. If this tale already has your heart racing, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support gives us the strength to keep uncovering the stories that deserve to be told. Julian Blackwell had never planned on taking the back roads. His assistant warned him it would be slower, less predictable, but the thought of highway traffic and the usual press vultures waiting outside his downtown tower made him take the long way. Somewhere between convenience and avoidance, the Shelby GT 500 began to sputter, and then die completely on the shoulder of a heat-struck road surrounded by nothing but dry grass and silence. He stepped out, furious, yanking at his tie, dialing 3 different roadside services, each more useless than the last. The meeting with the governor was now under 2 hours away. He paced, barked into his phone, checked his Rolex, and cursed under his breath, unaware that someone had stopped just behind him. Amira Johnson noticed the car first. Red, polished, foreign in a place like this. Its hood propped up, like a mouth gasping for air. She didn't recognize the model. Cars weren't about brands to her, just systems. Things to be understood and fixed. She hesitated a few steps, her aunt's warnings about strangers loud in her memory. But something about the man's voice, the crack just behind the frustration, pulled her closer. She adjusted her backpack, the weight of her books and the small metal case inside bouncing against her hip, and called out, "Mister, you need help?" Julian turned sharply, expecting some adult mechanic, maybe a rancher or passing trucker. Instead, a girl, barely up to his waist, dark braids, oversized t-shirt with an old college logo, eyes sharp enough to cut through his irritation. "I don't need help playing with toy engines," he said dryly. "This car needs a real mechanic." Amira walked closer anyway, her hands already unclipping the straps of her backpack. "My uncle's a mechanic. Taught me since I was little. I can take a look." She didn't wait for permission. Julian watched, unsure whether to yell or laugh, as she leaned under the hood like she'd done it 100 times before. She asked simple, pointed questions. "When did it stall? Any smells?" Julian blinked. "Smells. Like syrup." He paused. "Yeah. Actually, yeah." She pointed to the dark stain beneath the car. "Coolant. You've got a leak." The engine overheated and shut down to protect itself. She moved like she understood every part of it. She wasn't guessing, she was solving. Julian, for once, had no words. He watched her hands, steady, confident, pulling out a roll of industrial tape from a metal case far too neat for any child to own. She found the crack in the hose faster than his own mechanics probably would have and patched it clean. "You'll need to refill the coolant, or at least water for now. But this'll hold until town." And then, as she brushed a braid from her forehead, that's when he saw it. The ring. A flash of green against brown skin. The band aged gold, too wide for her finger, held in place by a piece of twine looped several times. The stone wasn't large, but distinct. Emerald, with a tiny crescent flaw inside. It hit Julian like a gut punch. He'd seen that ring before. Given it away, in fact, to a child who shouldn't exist. A promise, made and broken, 12 years ago. His voice caught before he could speak. "That ring," he said carefully, too carefully. Amira looked down, casually. "Was my mom's. She passed last year. Said it was special. That I'd understand one day." Julian's breath was stuck somewhere between disbelief and dread. He tried to keep calm. Do you know where she got it? Not exactly. Said someone important gave it to her before she adopted me. Told her to keep it safe. Julian offered her a ride. She hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Inside the car, the air was heavy with questions he couldn't yet ask. Instead, he listened. She lived with her aunt and uncle, Rosa and Theo. Good people. Her mother's only family left. She went to public school, fixed old radios for fun, and wanted to study engineering. Everything about her reminded him of someone. Not just the ring. The way she focused. The way she spoke. Julian drove in silence, each minute peeling away the years between him and the girl he once thought he'd save. They reached a small one-story house with cracked paint and wind chimes hanging from a sagging porch beam. Amira opened the door, unbothered by how out of place his car looked on the dirt road. Thanks for the ride, she said, turning to go. Julian stopped her, reaching into his coat pocket. Take this. A card. Embossed, black and gold. She raised an eyebrow. If you ever need anything, he added. Anything. She accepted it, unsure what to say. And just like that, she was gone. Julian sat in the driver's seat long after she disappeared inside. His hand trembled as he reached for his phone. Call Ramirez, he told the system. Tell him it's urgent. The image of that ring burned in his memory. The girl. The name. The timeline. It was impossible. And yet, deep down he knew. He never forgot that child. The one from the orphanage. The one they told him had been relocated. That promise he made with trembling hands and guilt-soaked hope. A ring slipped onto a little girl's finger moments before everything burned. Now, that ring was back, and the past was coming with it. Julian didn't sleep that night. He stared at the ceiling of his penthouse, city lights bleeding through the window, the ring replaying in his mind like a blinking warning sign he couldn't turn off. By morning, his voice was steady, cold. Ramirez, I need you to pull everything you can on a place called Silver Haven. His investigator didn't ask why. Ramirez had worked for Julian long enough to know that when the past resurfaced, it came with teeth. Julian gave him the year, 12 years ago, and the name of the director he vaguely remembered. Within hours, a preliminary folder landed in his inbox. Silver Haven Orphanage, closed in 2013 due to reported financial irregularities. Property sold quietly to a shell company. Most of the records had been archived, some missing, but there was a list, 50 names, children who had been relocated. One name, in bold red letters. Project Final, confidential. And nowhere on the list was Amira. Julian zoomed in, scanned every line. He recognized some of them. Kids he remembered playing with the day he visited. Smart kids. Oddly mature. Amira should have been there. But there was no Amira Johnson. Not by that name. Not by any variation. I want full background checks, Julian told Ramirez. Parents. Guardians. Medical files. Pull everything. He ended the call with more questions than answers. He had trusted his father's foundation back then, thought he was helping children get adopted into better homes. But something had always felt off. The ring had reopened a door he'd closed years ago. Now he wanted the truth. Miles away, Amira sat cross-legged on the floor of the workshop behind her aunt's house, wiping dust off a rusted amplifier she was trying to revive. Theo walked in, holding a weathered envelope in one hand. You should see this, he said. It's from Elena. She looked up. You mean my mom? He nodded and passed it to her. The envelope had her name on it, written in her mother's distinct handwriting. She opened it slowly, carefully. Inside, a folded letter and a photograph. Elena holding a baby wrapped in a yellow blanket, face turned away from the camera. The letter was dated 6 months before her death. My dearest Amira, it began. If you're reading this, it means the past has found you. And maybe, finally, the truth can come out. There's something I never told you. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure it would ever be safe. Amira paused, heart thudding. You were born in a place called Silver Haven. I worked there as a nurse. But it wasn't just an orphanage. Some of the children there had gifts. Not like fairy tales, real things. How they saw, remembered, created. The people funding the place started noticing. They wanted more than just to help. They wanted to own it. When I realized what they were planning, I ran. I took you. Changed our names. Hid. That ring you wear, it wasn't mine. It was given to you by someone who promised he'd protect you if anything ever happened. He never came. But I kept the promise for him. I hope, wherever he is, he's still looking. Amira read the letter twice. The photo again. Her mother had known everything. The secrecy, the hiding, even the ring. She looked down at it, now heavier than ever. A symbol of a broken promise and a story she was only beginning to understand. She folded the letter and slipped it into her backpack. There was more. There had to be more. Back in the city, Julian stood over his office desk, documents spread across the surface. A legal contract from the year the orphanage closed. A transfer of property. A signature he recognized too well, Richard Blackwell. His father had bought the land through a shadow firm, repurposed it into a biotech development site. The same site Julian had unknowingly greenlit for a new tech campus. Son of a bitch, he whispered. It wasn't just a donation gone wrong. His family had buried something, and they had done it under his name. The list of children from Silver Haven was growing shorter. Not because he was finding more, because many had disappeared. Adoption files erased. Some reassigned through private arrangements. One flagged as deceased under suspicious circumstances. Another institutionalized. Julian leaned back, connecting the dots. None of this was coincidence. He thought again about Amira. About the way she handled tools. The way she read that engine like it was a second language. She wasn't average. She was gifted. And if Silver Haven had been more than a shelter, if it had been an experiment, then she had been part of it. Whether she knew it or not. He picked up his phone. Ramirez, find out everything you can about a woman named Elena Johnson. She worked at Silver Haven. And check if she was connected to Richard's medical advisory board. Julian stared at the ring in the printed photograph. He still remembered the moment he gave it away. A silent promise to a frightened child. He thought it was for comfort. But maybe it had been a signal all along. In the days that followed, the pieces began to tighten. Amira's mother had never filed formal adoption papers. Her school records listed Theo and Rosa as guardians, not legal parents. Her birth certificate was a reissue from another state. Every detail about her life had been rebuilt from scratch. But she wasn't hiding. She had been hidden. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase her trail. Someone with power. And Julian was starting to realize just how deep his family's reach went. It wasn't just corruption. It was control. Silver Haven hadn't failed. It had served its purpose and then been buried. Now, one girl and one ring were bringing it all back. That night, Julian sat in his apartment, watching an old video on loop. It was from a charity gala, years ago. His father speaking on stage about unlocking potential in youth. Behind him, a slideshow flickered through images of Silver Haven children. One frame froze. A nurse holding a toddler in her arms, half turned from the camera. The necklace. The eyes. Julian paused the video, zoomed in. It was Elena. And that child, wrapped in a yellow blanket, was wearing the ring. The same one now on Amira's hand. Everything aligned. And now, he had no choice but to confront what really happened at Silver Haven, and who had tried so hard to make it disappear. Julian entered his father's study without knocking. The air inside smelled like old cigars and varnished lies. Richard Blackwell sat behind the same mahogany desk he'd used for 30 years, glancing up without surprise. "You look tired," he said, not bothering to stand. "It's been a long week," Julian replied, tossing a folder onto the desk. "Silver Haven. Remember that place?" Richard didn't blink. "One of the foundations your mother supported. Closed down years ago." "That's not all it was," Julian said. "I have documentation. Property transfers, erased files, shell corporations, and a list of children marked as classified assets. What kind of orphanage needs a classification system?" Richard leaned back. "You're chasing ghosts. Those children were placed into care, nothing more. Then why did half of them vanish off record? Why are some dead? Why is one of them, number 17, standing in front of me wearing a ring I gave her when she was 3? Richard's expression didn't change. But Julian had spent his whole life learning how to read between the lines of his father's calm. "You're not denying it," Julian added. "I want the truth." "The truth is," Richard said quietly, "those children were going nowhere. They were wards of the state, forgotten. We gave them purpose." Julian shook his head. "You experimented on them. Measured their abilities like lab rats. Used public money to test cognitive enhancement. And when it got too risky, you buried it. You have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't I? I've got a child with the IQ of an engineer patching cars on the side of the road." I've got a nurse who disappeared after running with her. And I've got your name on every document that tried to wipe them both off the map. Richard's eyes narrowed. You think you're going to fix this with guilt? You were a child when it happened. You had nothing to do with it. Except I funded the news site. I carried on the lie without even knowing it. That ends now. Richard stood finally, straightening his cufflinks. Then I suppose you'll do what you feel is right. Just don't confuse personal redemption with public destruction. Later that day, Amira left school like she always did, walking the short path that led past the playground and out toward the main street. She didn't notice the two men sitting in the black SUV parked near the edge of the lot. One of them adjusted his sunglasses. That's her, he said. Number 17. Same ring. We wait for the signal. Amira walked a few more blocks, humming to herself, unaware of the camera lens tracking her from across the street. Inside the SUV, a small screen showed her face, locked onto a database with flashing lines of code underneath. We'll follow for now. Orders are not to engage. The other man nodded. Yet. Meanwhile, in a small office above a bookstore in Dorchester, Damien Wolfe opened a file that had been locked in a basement archive for over a decade. The print was faded. Names, numbers, intake photos. He paused at page 17. A baby girl wrapped in yellow. Below the photo, handwritten, subject ID, a 17, exceptional mechanical intuition. Next to it, a signature, R. Blackwell. Damien picked up his phone and called the number he'd been given 2 days earlier. Amira Johnson? He asked when the line picked up. Her voice was cautious. Who's asking? My name's Damien Wolfe. I'm a journalist. I believe you were born in a facility called Silver Haven. I have something to show you. Silence. Then, where? Public library. Saturday. Noon. Bring the ring. Amira arrived early. She sat at a corner table, backpack on the floor. Damien approached carefully, holding a folder under one arm. You look like your mother, he said. She didn't respond. I worked a story years ago about orphanage funding. Hit a dead end when I reached Silver Haven. Now I know why. People wanted it gone. He opened the folder. Inside were photos, documents, scans of lab notes. One photo in particular froze her. It was her, younger, standing beside Elena. And in the corner, someone had circled her name in red ink. Subject A17, Damien said. You were part of something much bigger. They weren't just housing children. They were scanning them, testing their learning speeds, isolating behavior. You weren't adopted through official channels. Your mother took you and disappeared. That's why none of your paperwork exists. I already know some of it, Amira said quietly. I found a letter. Then you know they're not done, Damien said. I've intercepted emails. Private security firms are asking about your location. And that ring? It's not just a keepsake. It's a key. At that moment, across town, Ramirez sat in Julian's office, placing a single photograph on the table. We got eyes on the girl. 2 men tailing her after school. Unmarked vehicle. Out-of-state plates. Most likely private contractors. Whose payroll? Julian asked. Still tracing. But they're connected to a lab that spun off from your father's biotech division. Same money trail. Julian clenched his jaw. She's just a child. Not to them, Ramirez said. To them, she's an investment that got away. Back outside the library, Amira stepped into the sunlight, heart pounding. Damien followed, watching the street, but it was too late. The SUV had already pulled around the back. One of the men stepped out, walking with a fake casualness toward them. Amira saw the angle of his body, the way he didn't blink. Get behind me, Damien said. Don't speak. But before the man could get closer, another car screeched to a stop. Ramirez stepped out first, flashing a badge that wasn't exactly government issue, but looked close enough. The 2 suits backed off, and the SUV peeled away. Damien turned to Amira. You just made some very dangerous people nervous. Amira didn't flinch. Good. Ramirez handed her a phone. Julian wants to see you. That night, Julian watched the footage over and over. The tale, the way they tracked her. His father's silence suddenly made more sense. It wasn't just denial, it was defense. They weren't trying to forget what had happened. They were trying to keep it buried. But Amira had surfaced. And now, so had the truth. The surveillance tape was old, grainy, black and white. But the timestamp was clear. 2:13 a.m., the night Silver Haven went dark. They watched in silence as a woman, face partially hidden by a nurse's cap, clutched a child wrapped in a blanket and moved quickly down the corridor. The camera followed her for only a few seconds before the feed cut out. Julian leaned closer. "That's Elena," he said. "And that's Amira." Damien nodded. "We found the tape in a mislabeled archive box buried beneath a storage facility owned by one of the shell companies tied to your father. It was never meant to surface." Julian said nothing. He just stared, remembering the story Richard had told years ago. That the fire had destroyed all internal records. That there were no survivors unaccounted for. But this was proof that at least one child had been taken before the cover-up began. And it wasn't just any child. It was Amira. They had spent the last 3 days pulling threads, names, timelines, hidden documents. And now the web was finally starting to show its shape. Silver Haven hadn't been an orphanage. It had been a research lab with bunk beds and cartoon posters. Each child tagged, logged, monitored. Subject numbers, traits, behavioral shifts. Julian had seen the reports. Subject A04, accelerated memory retention. Subject B12, advanced spatial recognition. Subject A17, mechanical cognition anomaly. That one was Amira. They hadn't just tracked her, they'd studied her. Not because she was broken, because she was different. And different had value. He scrolled through the metadata attached to the footage. Elena's badge had been deactivated at 2:04 a.m. 9 minutes before she was caught on tape, meaning someone helped her. Someone inside. He looked at Damien. "Can you cross-reference security staff on that shift with employees who disappeared after the closure?" Damien nodded. "Already doing it." Amira sat nearby, arms folded, trying to stay calm. She wasn't scared. She was furious. All this time, she thought her mom was just paranoid. Now she realized Elena had been hunted. The lie hadn't been to protect Amira's innocence. It had been to protect her life. Julian stepped away from the table and stared out the window. His father had built an empire off this. Not just Blackwell Enterprises. The entire biotech division that launched 3 patented neurological products had roots that went back to Silver Haven. The Horizon Protocol, the Neuroprime Project, and something newer he hadn't yet accessed, Prometheus Initiative. All wrapped in innovation. All funded by manipulation. He turned back toward Amira. "What they did to you, to all of you. I didn't know. But you do now," she said. He nodded. "Which means I have to choose what I do with it." She didn't flinch. "Then choose." 2 days later, Julian sat at the head of a closed-door meeting on the top floor of Blackwell Tower. Around him were 7 executives, 1 legal advisor, and 2 members of the board. All handpicked by Richard. None of them knew what was coming. Julian placed a file on the table. "We're here to discuss the Prometheus Initiative," he began. "There are discrepancies in the program's origin. Discrepancies that tie back to Silver Haven." Someone cleared their throat. "That facility was shut down over a decade ago. That's not active business. Then why are current R&D funds being funneled into private labs connected to that site?" Julian opened the file. Inside were hard copies of transfers, authorizations, and encrypted communications. "I've uncovered evidence of unauthorized testing on minors. Historical, yes, but the cover-up is ongoing. And if we don't address it internally, it's going to surface publicly." Someone shifted in their seat. Another leaned forward. "Are you suggesting this company engaged in human experimentation?" Julian didn't answer immediately. He pressed a button and the screen behind him lit up with a still frame from the surveillance footage. "This is from Silver Haven, 2 hours before the facility burned down. The woman is a staff nurse. The child in her arms was designated Subject A17. That child is alive. She's a minor. And she wears the ring I gave her during my last visit to the orphanage. A ring that was meant to symbolize hope. Instead, it became a marker used to track her." A murmur moved through the room. "How much does the girl know?" someone asked. "Enough," Julian replied. "Enough to blow this entire company apart if we don't act now." "What about your father?" "He's aware," Julian said. "But he's not in this room. I am. And as acting CEO, I'm initiating a full internal audit and cooperation with federal authorities. I will not go down with this legacy. Neither should you." Silence held for a beat too long. Then, slowly, the board members nodded. One by one. Not because they wanted to, but because they understood. The storm was coming either way. Their only choice was which side they wanted to be on when it hit. And Julian had just drawn the line. The boardroom was packed. Every seat taken. High-level executives, legal counsel, senior shareholders. Most of them had no idea why they'd been called in on short notice. only that Julian Blackwell had demanded their presence without explanation. The silence was brittle. Then the doors opened. Julian entered first, calm, composed, followed by a girl no one recognized and a man who clearly didn't belong in a corporate tower. The girl stepped forward. It was Amira. She wasn't dressed for a boardroom. She wasn't supposed to be here at all, but she didn't flinch. In her hand, a small device, worn, metallic, unmistakably important. Julian spoke without ceremony. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce someone. This is Amira Johnson. She's here because of something that happened a long time ago, and because it never should have happened at all. Richard Blackwell stood from the far end of the table, face tightening. What is this? This, Julian said evenly, is the reckoning. Amira placed the device on the center console. With one subtle twist of the emerald ring on her finger, a light blinked on. The boardroom screen activated. Files began to load, hundreds of them. This device was hidden inside the ring I gave her when she was 3 years old, Julian said. Her mother, Elena, encoded it. It contains audio recordings, medical logs, personnel memos, financial transfers. Everything. A voice recording began to play. Richard's voice, clear, cold, instructing security staff to retrieve subject A17 for reevaluation. This was never meant to surface, Julian added. But it did. Richard's face paled, then turned red. Turn that off now, he barked. This is a violation of corporate policy. This is a live stream. Julian cut him off. It's already broadcasting. To the Boston Globe. To the U.S. Attorney's Office. To over 20,000 live viewers. The room erupted. Voices overlapped. Lawyers whispered into phones. A board member stood. Julian, do you understand what you've done? Yes, he said. I've done what should have been done years ago. The next screen displayed a list. Names, ages, designations. 48 children. Each one labeled with a project ID, their cognitive traits, and medical notes. Some had final outcomes listed, transferred, deceased, unknown. One name flashed red, Amira Johnson. Subject A17. Julian didn't wait for the dust to settle. Within a week of Richard's arrest, he liquidated his personal accounts, sold off the penthouse, the yacht, the vintage car collection, everything. The headlines called it shocking. Some said it was guilt. Others whispered strategy. But he didn't care. Every dollar went into the launch of Project Polaris, a nonprofit dedicated to locating, protecting, and cultivating children with rare cognitive talents. Kids like Amira, like the other 47 whose names were once reduced to code. This time, there would be no secrets, no labs, no files marked confidential. Just opportunity. Amira was the first to walk through the gates of New Haven. The old Silver Haven site had been leveled, the last concrete slab broken into dust, replaced by modern, open facilities built from the ground up. Classrooms lined with tools and whiteboards, labs filled with light, workshop floors humming with creative energy. She was no longer subject A17. She was Amira Johnson, founding student, lead inventor, and, unofficially, the soul of the place. She spent her days sketching blueprints, soldering wires, debugging code late into the night. Her first patent was already under review, an adaptive energy sensor that could calibrate to low-income infrastructure systems. She had named it Echo 1, in memory of the voices that had been silenced. Julian visited often, never as a CEO, never as a savior. He wore jeans and rolled sleeves, carried boxes, helped move lab benches when needed. He'd sit on the edge of projects, listen, ask questions, never command. The staff he hired came from education, engineering, neuropsychology, not finance. Most were former whistleblowers or activists themselves. No one here had anything to prove to shareholders. The only metric that mattered was trust. One by one, the others began to return. Kids whose lives had been fractured by the program. Damien helped track them down, following breadcrumbs through closed files and redacted court orders. A boy from Portland who could map entire cities from memory. A girl from Texas who decoded languages in weeks. A teen from Chicago who reconstructed shattered machines with no formal training. They were scattered, skeptical, and in some cases, barely functioning. But slowly they came. And when they did, they found something different. A place that didn't demand results. A place that let them breathe. Damien's article broke the internet in less than 48 hours. The girl in the ring that toppled a dynasty. The headline sat above a photo of Amira standing in front of the Project Polaris sign, her hands stained with engine grease, the emerald ring still on her finger. The story chronicled everything, from Silver Haven to the boardroom confrontation to the live-streamed takedown of one of the most powerful tech families in America. But what made the piece unforgettable wasn't the scandal. It was the resilience. He described Amira not as a victim, but as a spark, one that set fire to a legacy built on control. Universities reached out. Investors, too. But Julian declined the partnerships. Polaris didn't exist to generate prestige. It existed to rebuild what had been broken. The only support accepted came from grassroots donations, transparency-certified organizations, and the parents of children who had once been lost to the system. New Haven became a blueprint, replicated in 2 other states by the end of the year. At the center of it all, Amira kept building. Not because anyone expected her to, but because it was how she understood the world. Through wires and resistance and unexpected connections. She wasn't interested in attention. She didn't want credit. But when she spoke, people listened. She gave talks to younger students about how failure wasn't the opposite of genius. It was part of the equation. She started a mentorship program for girls in tech. She answered every letter from a kid who thought they were too weird, too smart, too much. Every reply ended the same way. You're not alone. Not anymore. Julian never returned to the corporate world. He turned down every interview, ignored every documentary pitch. When asked by a former colleague what it felt like to walk away from a billion-dollar empire, he only said, "It never belonged to me. But this does." And what he meant, though he never said it aloud, was that for the first time in his life, he wasn't standing on someone else's foundation. He was standing on his own. The empire had collapsed, but something better had taken its place. Not built from silence or secrets, but from repair, responsibility, and the courage to start over. 5 years later, Amira stood at the head of a packed auditorium wearing a navy jumpsuit smeared with ink and graphite dust. She was 15 now, but spoke with the clarity and weight of someone who had already lived 2 lifetimes. Behind her, the name of her foundation glowed on a digital panel. Novatech Youth Alliance, a nonprofit dedicated to defending and empowering gifted children from underserved communities. They didn't call them subjects anymore. They called them thinkers, builders, and leaders. Amira wasn't a face on a brochure. She was the founder, the engineer, the reason. Her 3rd patent had just been approved, a low-cost modular system that converted playground equipment into energy sources for schools with failing grids. But today wasn't about innovation. Today was about legacy. Julian sat in the back row, unnoticed, as always. His beard had grayed, his presence more ghost than man, but his funding kept half the programs running. He no longer appeared on board lists or press releases. He didn't want credit. What mattered to him now were results. Children who felt seen, systems being redesigned, cycles being broken. Every once in a while, Amira would text him a single line, "Still building." He never replied with more than 2 words, "Keep going." That afternoon, a package arrived at Amira's desk. No return address, only a name scribbled in slanted cursive, Veronica Blackwell. Inside was a folder, sealed in plastic, and a handwritten letter. "Amira," it began. "We haven't met. I walked away from my father's name years ago, but I followed your story. I believe in what you're doing. I also believe you should know. Silver Haven wasn't the only one. There were 5 others. Hidden deeper, documented worse. The same symbol marked them all, Prometheus. I've enclosed what I could find. Maybe it's your fight now. Or maybe it's ours." Amira sat with the letter for hours. She didn't speak, didn't move, just held the emerald ring between her fingers, twisting it slowly like she always did when something bigger than words settled in her chest. Then she got up, walked to the main balcony overlooking the labs, and looked up at the sky as it turned to dusk. The air buzzed with possibility, like it always did before something important. She held the ring to the light and whispered to herself the words her mother had once left behind, now hers to carry forward. Every broken system can be rebuilt, and every child deserves freedom. What would you have done if that ring had landed in your hands? If a single object unlocked someone else's buried truth, would you step forward or stay silent? Tell us in the comments. Your thoughts help us keep stories like this alive. And if this story moved you even a little, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We've only just begun.